Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this professional development opportunity for the Maine Department of Education. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the department. We are lucky today to have a very brief 30 minutes with Senator Susan Collins with us today. We've got a list of questions and a room full of social studies educators here in the state. So before we jump into questions, I'll turn it back over to Senator Collins really quick. Senator, is there anything you'd like to start off by saying to the group?
Well, Joe, first of all, thank you for offering this professional development opportunity. And as my staff knows, one of my favorite things to do is to visit schools throughout our state. I've had about 250 school visits, and I always enjoy them. I particularly like going to the elementary schools, I will confess. But it's always a treat to go to any of Maine's schools and see the dedication of the educators who are there. So I thank you all for all that you're doing, and I look forward to answering your questions to the best of my ability today.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Senator Collins. I know that looking through the list of people here, I know that we do have a good number of elementary teachers in here as well, so I'm sure they're excited to hear that. The first question I have for you is from Dawn Sire. She says, have you struggled at all with representing a state that is so diverse? Having grown up in Aroostook County and now living in southern Maine, I can definitely see major differences and needs throughout the state. Any thoughts?
Maine does have many different needs that tend to be based on geography in many ways. I was born and attended public schools in Caribou, where my family has lived for generations. I live in Bangor now, and obviously my job is to represent the whole state. It's been, to me, a good thing to see our state's population become more diverse from a ethnic perspective and racially. When I was growing up in Caribou, we were very lucky because Loring Air Force Base was very close by, and that brought us into contact with people of different races, religions, ethnicities, and I think that was very valuable. There was also a very strong Lebanese and Syrian community in Caribou, and plus a Swedish community from nearby New Sweden and Stockholm. So they enriched the environment. Predominantly, as you know, the population in northern Maine is French Canadian in its ancestry, but I think it's enriched our state. It was interesting, the Maine Community Foundation a year ago sponsored a trip to Aroostook County to try to encourage some of the Somali farmers to move up to Aroostook, where there is plenty of open farmland available. And I think the more diverse our state, in many ways, the richer that it is. But there's no doubt that the needs and also the culture of various parts of Maine are very different now from when I was growing up.
Well, thank you, Senator. Kind of building on that one, Bree Candlin has a question, and I think, we've managed to secure time. We talked with Senator King a couple weeks ago. We talked with Representative Golden earlier this week. And Bree is asking a question that we've gotten to ask everybody, was kind of what you talked about, those different ideas. And so she asked, how do you balance your own personal views with those of the constituents that you represent?
That's a great question, Bree. And what I would say is, obviously, I have a general philosophy that guides my approach to doing my job and representing the people of Maine. And I believe in compromise, civility, and competence. And I don't think that compromise is a dirty word, although nowadays that seems to have gone out of style. I've seen the growth of the far right and the far left, and I've also seen our state be pulled apart as forces, as people have become more ideological. Mainers have still always been practical, however, and applied common sense to issues, and that's been my overall philosophy as well. I've been very proud of the fact that for the past 7 years, I've been named the most bipartisan member of the Senate, and I'm proud of that designation. I believe if we had more people who are willing to work across the aisles and to actually listen to people with different views, that we would be better off as a nation. There are times when my personal views conflict with what I think is the best public policy. In those cases, I try to do what I think is best for the state and for our country. Some of my religious views, for example, differ from my public policy views, but I don't think I should impose my personal religious views on a public policy issue. Doesn't mean that it doesn't guide my general framework, but I don't think it's appropriate.
Thank you, Senator. I think we've got one more question that kind of follows that same vein. When we talked with Representative Golden on Tuesday, he talked about, in Maine, there's Congressional District 1 and Congressional District 2. And there's, some differences to that, kind of the views of those groups. And you've got to represent the entire state. So Pam Harriman asks, what's the approach when looking at the similarities or differences and kind of, even though you don't represent District 1 or District 2, specifically, it's still that whole range. So how do you handle when you've got such opposing, kind of maybe some different views across the state like that?
Well, the two districts have always been quite different, but I agree that philosophically they're now very different. The second district is far more conservative than the first. The first, particularly in the Portland area, has become very liberal in its philosophy overall. That doesn't mean that everybody shares liberal views in Portland, nor that everybody in the northern part of the state is more conservative. There's also a big difference between living in a more rural area and the challenges that are faced by rural areas versus the much more prosperous urban area right around Portland. So if you look at the economic disparities in our state, they are much more pronounced than they used to be, with the first district being much more prosperous than the second. There's also a demographic difference, and it's one that concerns me. The second district is becoming older, and the first district is becoming younger, and that difference is growing. Maine is already the oldest state by median age in the country, but if you look at it geographically, that's particularly pronounced in the second district. As far as how do I blend it, a lot of times the issues are different. For example, if I'm dealing with forestry and issues or issues affecting the wood products industry, those tend to be primarily in the second district. By contrast, some of the community development needs are more, well, they're all over the state actually, but in the southern part of the state, issues of mass transit, for example, or Amtrak that don't even exist in the second district, with the exception of some limited bus service in Bangor and Lewiston. But those are big issues in the first district. So sometimes there isn't a conflict because the issues are just different depending on where you are. But there's no doubt that ideologically, I see far more of a difference than I did when I first was fortunate to be elected to the Senate. in the end, my approach is to study the issue and do what I think is in the best interests of the state of Maine.
Senator, it's almost like you've been reading ahead on the questions here a little bit, because you went ahead and bridged into the next ones I was going to ask. A little bit about infrastructure, but 3 different people have asked some version of this question, so I'm going to kind of blend a couple together. It's the internet infrastructure of Maine, and you have somebody from a southern Aroostook County chiming in, and also somebody talking about District 2 specifically with rural. The idea that, especially with educators right now, as they're having to do so much online to reach out to their kids, and there's so much inequity with internet access, people are asking, like, how do you see moving forward, trying to help those in rural areas get internet? How do you help teachers make sure their kids have access? Some version about that, like the idea of the infrastructure of Maine around technology and internet.
Well, this is a great example of the geographic divide in our state, although I will say that I've lost cell phone coverage in downtown Portland many a time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it is strictly a rural-urban issue, but it is a very serious issue. My husband just this morning had a telemedicine appointment with his doctor. And telemedicine is something that is so important for the rural areas of our state, where we have fewer healthcare providers and fewer healthcare facilities. And I think you're going to see telemedicine being used more often, but we can't use it if we don't have adequate broadband services in the rural parts of our state. So this has been a priority of mine for some time. I have introduced a bill that would provide additional federal funding to expand broadband service throughout underserved and unserved areas of our state. It would require a small local match and also a match by the internet service providers so that everyone would have some skin in the game. One of the mistakes that I've seen over the years is we put a lot of money into expanding broadband and the reach of the internet, but it's tended to not focus on the last mile out to rural communities or rural homes. And what we seem to be doing, and I remember when I supported the stimulus bill that President Obama had, it had a lot of money for this purpose, and yet it was awarded to a contractor who, I am told by the telecommunications companies, essentially duplicated the rings around Maine that we already had, rather than building out into Washington County or Piscataquis County or Northern Aroostook County. Actually, Northern Aroostook is pretty good, because what happens is you get connected to the Canadian system, even if you don't want to be, as you're driving by, as I've learned many times when I have to call the company and convince them that no, I shouldn't have to pay roaming charges to Canada. And the islands off Maine are another area. So I do have a bill that would provide more money for that. In addition, there was additional funding that was put into the farm bill when we passed that. So these are investments that I think are absolutely imperative, not only for education and medicine, but for economic development. As more and more people are working from home, I don't want them to be constrained from being able to do so because they lack access to the internet. And that's what I fear, that we're getting into a haves and have-nots situation. And I want people to be able to live wherever they want to live, whether it's on an island or deep in the woods of Maine or any part of Maine, and still have the ability to telecommute, get telemedicine, and if necessary, at times of crisis like this, to do teleeducation. Can I
Anna,
add just one point too?
yeah, absolutely.
Um, when we think of infrastructure, and I chair the Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation, and I'm very involved in infrastructure. In fact, I've been able to bring more than $500 million to the state of Maine for bridges and seaports, airports, roads, etc. But what has always bothered me is when we think of infrastructure, we've got to broaden how we think of infrastructure beyond roads and bridges and airports and seaports, and think of internet and broadband connections. That is as vital a part of our infrastructure now as roads and bridges. It really is.
Oh, our next question is from Leslie. And she had said one of the things that Representative Golden talked about was, as like the quarantining and all that stuff is moving forward, like Congress was not really set up to work remotely. And that was kind of a new challenge for everybody. But yet teachers who are also unprepared are still continuing, to work through that system. And she's just wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of your new experience as, working in Congress on this. And then again, maybe a little bit of comparison about what our teachers are going through right now.
Well, it's been a challenge to all of us, and I will readily admit that prior to this pandemic, I had never heard of Zoom, and now I am doing Zoom calls every day, literally every day, with groups of constituents that normally I'd be meeting in my office with or going to visit them and in their workplaces. So I was behind the curve on understanding that Zoom existed, and also how to protect Zoom so that it couldn't be infiltrated, because early versions of it were very easily hacked. And I know from being on the Intelligence Committee that there were also concerns about the Chinese being able to hack into Zoom. So I've had to learn this whole new way of doing business. What I've found, and I bet this is true of so many of you as well, is I'm busier now, even busier. I couldn't have guessed I could be busier than when I was in Washington, because it's a lot of work to prepare for these and conference Zooms, and also I don't have staff here with me to help me. My staff is working in our state offices and taking care of constituents, and our casework has gone through the roof. Just to give you an idea, we helped get home 94 Mainers who were in 100 different countries and were stuck because of no transportation. That's typical. That's not typically the kind of casework that we would be doing. And so we've had to learn a whole new way to make sure we're in touch. But I've also found that when I return calls to people, they want to chat a lot longer than normal. And I don't know whether you've found that to be true as well. And also I'm really cognizant. My mother celebrated her 93rd birthday this week, and I felt so bad that I couldn't zip up to Caribou to be with her, with my husband, and bringing our black lab, which she loves. And yet preventing that social isolation is so critical. I'm lucky that my two brothers, younger brothers, are still in Caribou and could be with her, but I'm worried about, I mean, it's wonderful that we can do this, but I'm worried about seniors who may not have access to this kind of technology and may be living all alone, and their families have moved out of state and people are fearful of visiting them. They're not able to go to the Congregate Meals Center to get lunch anymore because that's closed, or to meet friends at a restaurant for lunch. And they're having Meals on Wheels delivered to them for the first time, but they're being left outside now, so they're not getting the interaction that they used to get. And I held a hearing in the Aging Committee last year, and the statistics are just stunning about what prolonged isolation and loneliness can do to your physical, mental, and emotional health. It's the equivalent to your physical health of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I know I've gotten a little off topic there, but that just astonishes me. So the big surprise for me is I'm busier now even than I was in Washington, and I wouldn't have thought that was possible. And I bet that's true of all of you, because you've had to learn a whole new way to teach, to communicate, and to educate. And I just can't imagine how difficult it must be to translate lessons that you'd prepared that were for one method, and now all of a sudden it's totally different. So I suspect you're experiencing that as well. And I'm seeing some heads nod that is the case.
Senator, one of the things that we talked about with Representative Golden was a hierarchy of needs, like for states. And obviously, like in the House, California has more representatives than Maine. But in the Senate, that's not true. It's two apiece. And so Gina's wondering, do you still see is there a hierarchy of states when it comes to like getting their needs met, or is Maine's voice pretty equal to the others?
You know, what's really important in the Senate is seniority. If you are a senior member, you have better committee positions. You get to be a chairman if you're, or if you're a Republican right now with the Senate in control, or a ranking member if you're a Democrat. I, for example, if I'm reelected after 2 more years, I will become the chairman of the most powerful committee in the Senate, the Appropriations Committee, on which I serve now as a subcommittee chairman. And Maine has not had someone in that position since 1932. That's how long it has been. So seniority determines in the Senate your committee position, whether you get to be a chairman. And if you are in those positions, you're able to do more for your state. And that's what really controls in the Senate. I never served in the House. I know seniority is important there as well. But I can tell you in the Senate, with only 100 members and every state having, just as you pointed out, having the same 2 numbers of senators, that's what really makes the difference in the Senate.
Senator, I know you have to go at 2 o'clock. Do you feel like you've got time for 2 more or just 1 more question?
2 more is fine.
Okay.
I'll try to be less loquacious.
Oh, that's okay. The second one, your last one, will be a fun, light one where you can tell a story. So we'll end on that. Well, so I'll give you your preview. Your last question is about Senator Smith and your experience with her. So that'll be your last question.
I lost you.
You lost? Okay.
You blipped out, Joe. So say it again, please.
Sure. Your preview for your last question it's about Senator Smith. So you get to tell us a story about Senator Smith. But your second to last question is from Logan Landry, who he wants to know, what is the hardest decision you've had to make as a senator down in Washington?
There have been a number of difficult decisions over the years, as you can well imagine. One of them was my decision to vote to acquit Bill Clinton, and I was a very new senator. I had only been in the Senate for, I think that was 1999, and I'd been sworn in 1997 at the beginning of the year. So I was a new senator, and all of a sudden I was thrust in this impeachment trial. And I remember being angry about the president's lying about his affair with Monica Lewinsky. But when I went through the constitutional standards and talked to a friend of mine who was a law professor at Harvard, I found that I could not find that the president was guilty in the sense of high crimes and misdemeanors, even though he had lied to a grand jury. And it's difficult because apply in a normal court proceeding, I had to apply a constitutional standard of whether we should overturn the results of an election. So I voted to acquit President Clinton on both counts, and it was difficult. And when I remember coming home and going to a Lincoln Day dinner in Somerset County, and my fellow Republicans being furious at me. And, but I explained the process I went through, and I felt that I had reached the right decision. So there've been many difficult ones, but that one's was probably the most difficult, given that I was new at the job and it was such a weighty decision.
Well, we'll move from a difficult one to more of a fun one then. So your last question from the group is from Tyler Duran. He says, how did your experience spending the day back when you were a high school senior, getting to spend some time with Senator Margaret Chase Smith, how did that impact your decision to move forward into a career of public service?
Well, first of all, if your schools do not participate at the high school level in the Senate Youth Program that is run by the William Randolph Hearst Foundation, I would strongly encourage you to do so. It is a wonderful program, and when I was a senior at Caribou High School, I was one of the 2 students from Maine chosen to go to Washington for a week. And I had never been on an airplane. I had never been to Washington. I had never met a United States senator. And here my senators were Ed Muskie and Margaret Chase Smith. I mean, it truly doesn't get better than that. And I was so thrilled to have the opportunity to meet both of them. But Senator Smith, for whatever reason, took me into her inner office rather than doing the quick photo, which is what most senators would do and what I do. So it's not critical of anybody. But she spent nearly 2 hours talking with me, a high school girl from Caribou. And I was astonished that she did. She talked to me. Interestingly, she never talked to me about what it was like being the only woman in the Senate. And I think that's really telling and interesting, because she didn't think of herself as a, quote, woman senator. She thought of herself as a senator. And she served on the Armed Services Committee. She talked about that. She gave me a copy of her famous Declaration of Conscience. And it was absolutely inspiring. And I remember leaving her office and thinking that women could do anything. Now, I realize that everybody knows that nowadays, and that the girls that you teach know that, but this was back in 1971. And I wasn't quite sure back then. I mean, I hoped that women could do anything, but I remember that when I was 10 years old, my dentist telling me that women couldn't be dentists, which was, of course, absurd. But being 10 years old and told that by my dentist, I immediately eliminated that possibility. And I don't think the world is poorer for my not having become a dentist, I hasten to say, but that's how influential people are and role models are. And that's why I make a point of visiting schools, because Margaret J. Smith spending that time with me did cause me to realize that women could do anything. And I was so proud that she was my senator. She followed up with a letter to me. I've got framed in my office 2 letters from her, one in response to my offer to volunteer on her campaign when I was a freshman in college. And I didn't know it at the time in any way, but when I look back, I think that that meeting was the start of my journey to the United States Senate. And 25 years later, I ran for the Senate. And today I sit at Margaret Chase Smith's desk on the Senate floor. So that's really cool for me. And I, so it was definitely influential. That whole week was so influential to me. I should also give credit to my mother, who also taught me by her example that women could play leadership roles. I often joke that my mother always became chair of any board that she was either elected to or that she ran for. And when I was a senior in high school, she signed my diploma as chairman of the school board in Caribou. So that was really neat as well. And she went on to become the first woman to ever chair the University of Maine System Board of Trustees. So I had a great role model at home as well in both my parents, but Margaret Chase Smith was certainly one for me as well. And that program really, in many ways, changed my life.
Well, I appreciate, Senator, as the person who's in charge of facilitating that for the state of Maine. I appreciate the shout out for the United States Senate Youth Program. It's really amazing to watch the young people who participate in that. It's a very tough decision every year, and Tricia has done work with that as well and
Yes.
participating in that as well. So I know that you're late. I appreciate you telling all the stories and running over time just a little bit. So on behalf of everybody here, the chat room is already filling up with people saying thank you and a lot, for your time and stuff like that. So Senator, thank you from us and from educators for your time today so much.
Well, thank you for all that you do. Talk about people who change lives. You are people who change lives, and I'm very grateful for all the work that each and every one of you does and how much you care about your students. And I really recognize how challenging this must be for you. So thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.